back. We're live. It's 4 o'clock on a Monday after Christmas and before New Year's, a special week, I think. I'm Jay Fidel, and this is actually Think Tech Asia, Asia in Review. So it's perfect that we have you on the show today. Pamela Rotner Sakamoto, a historian and an author. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Jay, for having me.
And we have a book on the table. It's Midnight in Broad Daylight, and that's our focus. This is a book of a true story, a Japanese-American family caught between two worlds. And it's just perfect that it comes out now, because just a few weeks ago, we had a similar story of the same kind of contention, in part true. I don't know if they claim all of it true, but in part true, which is playing on Broadway, which we've covered here on the show, called Allegiance. And a local surgeon by the name of Mark Mugaishi is the producer of that show. I've seen it. So has Pam.
No, I just saw it when it was in the works, and I'm just so thrilled that it's proving so successful, and it's a wonderful story and deserves a long run on Broadway. So I'd love to see it there someday.
Wonderful story. You know, we live in a time in our lives where we've seen a lot of wonderful stories about the contention, about the coming together of the Caucasian world and the Asian world. I mean, it goes back to Madame Butterfly. It goes to Miss Saigon. The coming together of these two races, these two civilizations, is such a touching story. Why is that? It's in our art, it's in our culture, it's certainly in our history. And it's especially American. Although, you know, Madame Butterfly was American. It's all American, isn't it? It's the touching between the American culture and, more often than not, the Japanese culture. Were you aware of this? I mean, it's something you've studied. You studied Japanese-American relations. You studied Japanese. So you must have been aware of this thread in our culture and our art about Japanese-American coming together.
Well, I think I really am fascinated by the intersection of cultures, and being an American who lived in Japan for 17 years, and I experienced those worlds myself, but then to have the opportunity as a historian to research past worlds has been really gratifying and fascinating.
Yeah, wow. A historian writing a book, it's always a special book because, you know, you test it by historical standards. But let's talk about how you got those standards in the first place. You went to school at Amherst?
Yes.
And studied what? Among other things, literature, I'm sure?
Well, I actually had a double major. One was in Spanish literature, because I'm so interested in Europe and the Romance languages. And
Does
the
that
other,
mean you speak Spanish?
Well, it's so rusty I won't even try.
Okay.
And also in Asian studies, and where I had my first introduction to Japan. And so once I began studying, I realized that I needed to go there. And I went immediately upon graduation, and ultimately ended up spending a very long time there, and moved to Hawaii in 2007.
You were a coiled spring, waiting to go to Japan. So what was it about, you know, Japan that attracted you even in college?
You hit the nail on the head earlier. I actually was fascinated by the art. It was the early 80s, and the era of Japan is #1. That was Ezra Vogel's best-selling title. Japan was just amazing in terms of its economic development and its technology, and it seemed as if actually the U.S. was falling behind, but that wasn't what drew me in. What drew me in was this incredible artistic culture, and I felt that language was a window into the culture, and that I needed to learn some of the language in order to understand. And Japanese is rigorous, it's time-consuming, and as I studied it, I realized I needed to go there. And then once I went there, I was incredibly fascinated all over.
You found you were right. You needed the language, and through the language you could learn the culture and the art, rather, and then the culture.
So I'm not an art historian, but I still love that aspect of Japan.
Yeah. What's your favorite city in Japan?
I first went and lived in Kyoto for a couple of years.
I knew that. Shinmosen Street. Does it make it? My wife and I were there. It's a street which is covered with art on all sides. It's commercial art. It's artists selling their art. But that was the sense. I remember it now for almost 50 years ago.
Oh, well, it's a great university town, and the ceramics and silk and lacquerware and food and beautiful spots. But Tokyo, too, it's a mega city, one of the world's greatest, largest cities with a huge crowded population, but yet it works and it has a lot of charm as well. So it's a really, really interesting place to live.
Yeah, I want to deal on that for just a minute. Charm. It's a soft, warm place, Japan. You could not be a Japanophile. You don't have to be a Japanophile to go to Japan and to find a nice, soft, warm culture that will envelop you, which you can enjoy. The food and everything around you is sort of easy to deal with. People are kind and they're welcoming. It's a fun place to go. There are few places in the world that are as fun to travel in, don't you think?
Well, it's very safe, and so it's
Safe.
very manageable,
Yeah.
and people are predisposed to Americans. But it's helpful when you're Caucasian, of course. If I had been going as a Japanese American, it would have been a different story.
But since you are a bilingual, or at least bilingual, exercising the Spanish for a minute, just English and Japanese, that gives you a tremendous advantage, no?
Well, when I first went, my Japanese needed a lot of work, and still, it's a work in progress. But right, the language opens doors, and it's really very revealing what you can learn when you have access. So.
Yeah, and then the other thing is that the U.S. and Japan have a really special relationship. I mean, we had a bad war, and yes, we blew up 2 of their cities. That wasn't nice. But we were kind to them with the Marshall Plan and all that. After the war, we gave them a lot to help them rebuild, and I think we have as good a relationship with Japan as with any Asian country, both ways. And it's really nice to have that, and it reflects itself in the way we conduct our business with them. Didn't you find that?
Well, I think that is one of the strongest alliances in the world in terms of for the United States, and has been for decades. And I do think that is, in very good part, a product of how successful the occupation was.
Yes.
And part of the backbone of the U.S. occupation of Japan and the Allied occupation of Japan is this Japanese-American presence that is sort of not really known, but there were thousands of Japanese Americans working for the occupation, and they had language and they had cultural understanding, and they were able to really smooth the differences and perhaps speed the occupation along, and made a huge difference. And I think the story is about one of those individuals who was really a bridge between the United States and Japan. I think it's a model that we should try to use in other places. If we are at war and we have forces there, we need our multicultural, multilingual Americans to have a presence, and they can work wonders, and we have to acknowledge them.
Yeah, soft power.
Yes, it's huge.
Soft power was invented in the Fletcher School, wasn't it?
It's right. It's diplomacy or diplomacy. It's.
You went to the Fletcher School.
Yes, I did.
And you studied, among other things, Japanese-American relations.
Yes.
There. Yeah.
Yes.
So by the time you went to Japan, you were well ready.
Well, ready, yes, and then you actually live and experience the trenches of daily life.
Yeah. And you saw, didn't you? You saw in Japan the remnants, maybe that's the wrong word, but the residue of the whole experience you talked about after the war, with the Japanese Americans participating in the rebuilding of Japan, because they stayed, a lot of them stayed, didn't they?
Right, and they're just on a whole tier higher than most officials, because they had such innate understanding and such incredible competence, and were very American, but at the same time, very respectful towards the Japanese, and the Japanese were well aware of that.
So it was a great chapter in American history, I think. And when I started practicing law here, which was 50 years ago, I became aware of a law firm in Tokyo called Mori Rabinowitz.
I've heard of
Did
it.
you know
It's a
about that?
big one.
And one of the lawyers in my firm had been an intern in that firm, and he'd seen it firsthand. These were two guys, or actually three, Mori Rabinowitz and somebody else, I can't remember the third name, but they were in the army together in the occupation, and they got the dispensation from MacArthur to stay around after and participate in the rebuilding of Japan as a law firm. They were lawyers, all American. And they stayed there. Their firm is still intact after all these years. They participated in the enormous growth of trade between Japan and the U.S. So it's just a little part of that story you're talking about. So what motivated you to write this book? This book meaning Midnight in Broad Daylight, a Japanese-American family caught between two worlds.
What motivated me was that I met the person who becomes the protagonist in the story, Harry Fukuhara, a retired U.S. Army colonel in Japan by chance. And I was so taken by his story, and he hadn't really talked about it, and he was in his 70s. And I just felt that I wanted to know more, and the more I learned, the more I felt that it was okay, it was wonderful that he was telling me, but I wanted other people to know about it too. And after 4 years of talking to each other, I asked him if he was interested in having a book written. And I said I wasn't even sure that I was the right person, but I thought that he needed to leave a record of his experiences for his family, for his generation, for the Japanese American community, and for U.S.-Japan relations. And he introduced me to his brothers, and we were off and running. That was in 1998. We've been talking since 1994, so this book has taken a very long time.
It's a big part of your life.
Yes.
It's like taking another degree or 2 or 3 or 4.
It's like another child.
Really. So the first was more like a social connection with him, and then you got serious about it.
Right, I was busy, he was busy, and he was actually retired and living in California, but he would come several times to Tokyo, where I was living, on sort of Pentagon business or for social reasons. And he would call me every time he came to have lunch with him. And he was very much a mentor to many, and a real extrovert, very charming and dignified gentleman. And I would go and meet him at the Nusano Hotel, which is a U.S. Navy hotel.
I know it well. I've been there.
Yeah. It's sort of a hub for people who want
of imperialism, if you will.
Right, but and we would have cheeseburgers, nice tea there, and I couldn't get a really good cheeseburger, so it was a lot of fun for me. And we would chat, and he would tell me his story, and it's a gripping one. But as a historian, I really needed to know whether I could document it and how to approach it. And so I warmed up to that approach over time, and he warmed up to the idea of whether he wanted to really open his life to another.
It's interesting commentary on your life that you were first drawn into the Japanese-American thing and history and diplomacy, and now drawn into this book. It's you see opportunities, Pam, and you go for them. You let life take you, and you take advantage.
Well, it was so unusual for me. I mean, I grew up on the East Coast, and I did not have exposure to the U.S. internment of Japanese Americans. And when I first heard his story, and that's an element of it, I was appalled. I was actually ashamed that I, an educated person, had never learned about the internment at school. And I think that the U.S. does a better job now. A lot of middle schoolers will learn about it, whether they're in the public or private system, and there are some wonderful books. One of the classics is Farewell to Manzanar, which is Jean Wakatsuki Houston's memoir of her life in the what they now call concentration camp of Manzanar. But I just felt I needed to correct that own gap in my own education, and that this was this global topic because it involved life in the U.S. and life in Japan. And I love, as I said, that meeting of cultures.
Yeah, you see a vacuum and you need to fill it.
I do like to vacuum.
That's Pam Sakamoto. She is the author of Midnight in Broad Daylight, which is nonfiction, a Japanese-American family caught between two worlds. And when we come back from this break, we're going to find out how this book works, and we're going to get the details of the story. We'll be right back.
Aloha! Please join the Hawaii Farmers Series every Thursday on Think Tech. We live stream from 4 p.m. to 5 p.m. And we are
Matthew Johnson and Justine Spiritu as your hosts.
And the purpose of the Hawaii Farmers Series is to get to know our local agriculture community a lot more, get their backgrounds, get their history, find out why they love what they do, as well as get some of their insights.
And insights into hearing about the future of agriculture in Hawaii.
So we're going to bring the experts on, but we'd also like you to be a part of the conversation. So you can always join us by tweeting in your questions and comment at ThinkTechHigh. So we hope to engage with you. Thanks.
Okay, we're back. We're live. We're here with Pam Sakamoto talking about her book, which is coming of age right now. You're going to do a book signing next week, is it?
Yes.
And what's the book signing like? This is your second book, so we need to know what you expect.
Well, my first book is an academic book, and so there was no signing, and I was living in Japan at the time with a toddler, and we just launched it out there, and it's been picked up by university libraries, which is the market. But this is a trade book. This is for any reader interested in a family story, a sweeping epic during war. And will be my first signing on Tuesday, January 5th at Ala Moana at the Barnes Noble there in the evening at 7. And I'm excited, a little nervous, and I'll give a short talk and take questions and do a reading.
That's great. Well, we are so delighted to have you here in advance of the book signing.
Thank you.
So, you know, I mean, it's a huge accomplishment to take a story like this and do what amounts to academic controls on it. I mean, this is an accurate narrative of what happened. You have a substantial index in the back, and you've researched everything in here and talked to the individuals who were involved in the story. That is something. At the same time, you've made it readable so that anyone can read it and get the benefit of what happened. A contribution, at the least. Let's talk about how the story unfolds, Pam.
Well, I start literally with Harry, who is the middle child in this Japanese-American family. His parents are Japanese immigrants, legal immigrants to the United States with the great flow of Japanese immigration in the early 1900s. His mother was a picture bride, and he is raised outside Seattle in a small town called Auburn. And I start with him. He believes that he is just as American as everyone else, and he just loves his life. And nothing can disturb his sense of self or his routine until the Great Depression, which affects so many American families. But it particularly devastates an immigrant family, and it particularly devastates immigrant families in which there is state wide discrimination, and Japanese immigrants to the U.S. cannot purchase land, and they really cannot get an economic toehold.
This is well before the war now.
This is in the early 1900s and right into the Great Depression in the 1930s. And so what happens is that the patriarch of the family, very successful businessman, but a small businessman limited by discrimination, dies of pleurisy, something that would be cured today by antibiotics. And their mom is now a widow of 5 children with her middle son, Harry. And she literally cannot afford to stay in the United States. She has a few months worth of rent money in her savings account. But if she moves back to her native Hiroshima, she has family, the cost of living is much lower, the exchange rate is favorable, and she decides to move back. And
Interesting choice.
yeah.
I mean, you know, we're brought up to think that the U.S. was always a better place to be, but not. And she could make it in Japan. She couldn't make it in the U.S.
No, and she worried terribly about her children, that even if they did go to college, and she and her husband certainly hoped and planned that they would not be able to find good jobs because they were ethnic Japanese. And in fact, she had sent two of her children, along with her husband had agreed, Victor and Mary, the oldest, earlier in their lives for Japanese education, in the hope that if they were raised bilingually, they would have more job opportunities in the future. And so you have basically two families. You have the older kids who've been partly educated in Japan, then come back to the U.S. before their dad dies, and they're totally disconnected with their family's life and with English and American culture. And then you have this younger family with Harry and his two younger brothers, these American boys, and she takes all of them back to Japan, and they struggle.
Yeah, I mean, just stopping there's a lot of conflict in all of that. There's contention of whether two cultures are trying to touch each other, but not, it's hard for them to touch each other. How did they come to the U.S. in the first place?
Well, the boys are, all of the children, all five, from Victor, the eldest, Mary, the only girl, and Harry, Pierce, and Frank, are all born in the U.S. They are American citizens.
But the Issei, what about them?
The parents, the Issei, the first generation, the dad came to work on the railroads along with the Japanese burst of poor boys coming to work on the railroads following the Chinese. And he is able to get some education. He's very entrepreneurial. He's able to become a white-collar professional worker, businessman. And his wife, a beautiful woman, comes as a picture bride. Arranged marriage by their families in
And you know,
Hiroshima.
that really worked.
Yeah.
People make fun of it now, you know, cultural aberration, but no, it really worked.
It was a
They
good
were-
marriage.
Yeah, interesting.
Yeah.
You know, I wonder, in the course of your travels and putting this book together, whether you got any sense about whether the prejudice against the Japanese was the same as the prejudice against the Chinese, because the Japanese came after the Chinese did. And same here in Hawaii. But was the prejudice different some way against the Japanese?
It was very similar. It was part of the great yellow peril wave in which Asians who were invited to come and were taking jobs that others did not want. Working on the railroads was hard, dirty, dangerous work. But they were then perceived as so successful that they would take away Caucasian jobs. And so once the Chinese were excluded, the Japanese filled their spots, but they too were soon excluded legally. So it's very tough.
The other thing I want to catch is, you know, although the parents were sending the children back to Japan for schooling and all that, at the same time they were making every effort to assimilate into U.S. culture. And by the time, you know, these kids were grown, the ones here anyway, they spoke good English, right?
Their English was native. They were no different from Johnny Smith next door.
Yeah, there was no question of a bifurcation there. They were as American as the kid next door.
Absolutely.
And by the time the war happened, they were American as the kid next door. And that's why it was such a shock to see the Manzanar internment camps come up. And it was such a shock to see them, for that matter, discriminated against, because they were trying as hard as any other immigrant group to assimilate into the U.S.
Right, and the kids did go to Japanese language school after their American school day ended.
I went to Hebrew school.
I was just going to say, very similar. And the general nationwide approach by Japanese organizations towards language school was that, yes, we will teach them Japanese, but we are teaching them Japanese in order to become Americans. And so we must always also teach American history. And so these kids they actually didn't want to go to language school often. it was just a chore that they did to satisfy their parents.
Wasn't that always the case? The language from the old country kind of schools, yeah,
Right.
sure.
So Harry, I mean, he did everything he could to avoid school, and he was, at 13, he was still in the second grade because the teacher was so angry at him, he would not allow him to advance. So he didn't actually learn his really, truly flawless Japanese until he went to Hiroshima.
Okay, well, evolve the plot for us.
So the mom, Kinu, takes the 5 children back to Hiroshima in 1933. And 2 in particular, Harry, who's 13 and is really an American teenager at the time, and his sister Mary, who has come back from Japan and reacclimated to the U.S. They're irate. They want to be back in the U.S. And they convince their mom that if they graduate high school in Japan, they can go back to the United States. Mary does go back first. She's older, and that's quite a bold thing for a young single woman to do. And Harry does as well in 1938. He cannot wait to see his friends from his hometown. He has maintained a steady correspondence. Today he'd be a social media guru, but he goes back and he's given a very chilly welcome because U.S.-Japan relations in 1938
deteriorated in that period.
already,
Yeah.
it's a shock to him, one that he doesn't really recover from. He also finds that he cannot make a living. He has a Japanese high school degree. He ends up working in the fields as a day laborer, picking all kinds of strawberries and other produce, and slowly makes his way actually down the coast and ends up in the Los Angeles region.
That is a hard, this is a hard one. He has friends, he writes to the friends, he's the same friends anymore. They have profiled him. And that was probably going on all up and down the West Coast, the same kind of thing. It was a really not very becoming facet of the American culture at the time. People were turning into discrimination. They were rejecting somebody they already knew based on race. Not a pretty picture at all.
No, it's a very sad chapter.
And if you're the victim at the wrong end of that, you can't understand it. I thought you were my friend.
Yeah,
You're not my friend.
my best friend even,
My
right?
best friend.
Oh.
And so you got information about these relationships. How did you get this information from Harry?
Well, from Harry and his brothers and his sister and cousins and friends, and I went to his hometown and interviewed people. I found people in the yellow pages of names that he had given me and tracked them down. And he introduced me to many acquaintances, and Harry, Frank, and I visited together his hometown. We went to Los Angeles and found the house where he had lived in subsequently. And so there's a lot of oral history in this book, too.
Sure.
Yeah.
Photographs?
Photographs as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ooh. Oh, let me just find one and we'll hold it
They're
up to
in
the
the
camera.
middle.
They're in the middle, okay. Okay, we're going to take a look at these for a minute. Can you find them for me?
Okay, sure. Oh, let's see.
That must have been an interesting trip to go back to these places with Harry.
Oh, it was wonderful.
And,
Yeah, I went to Hiroshima mostly with Frank, though. Harry, Harry, Frank, and I were on the west coast of the United States together. But Hiroshima was a place that only Frank would go. Harry never wanted to go there.
So this is a picture of what?
The,
Issei.
those are the parents, the first generation immigrants, Katsuji and Kinu, really lovely couple, married legally in Japan before she emigrated to the United States as a picture bride.
Yeah, okay, there we got it. It's kind of reflecting, but there's the picture. And there's a number of pictures from the family album here.
Yes.
This helps
Including
to,
part of
make
the
you
cover.
Understand, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, there's a bunch of photographs on the cover. Yeah, okay. Well, there's more yet because now we have the war coming.
Yes.
And we have the bisection, the bifurcation of the family during the war. This is very interesting, and we have to cover this. Right after this break, we'll come back.
Okay.
I can hardly wait.
Aloha, I'm Jim Sean, the host of Think Tech Hawaii's Education Movers, Shakers, and Reformers, interviews with people who have special insights into education from preschool through adult education. We are live streaming every Wednesday at noon, also posted on YouTube and the Hawaii Educational Policy Center. Please join us weekly for some of the amazing, innovative movers, shakers, and reformers in education in Hawaii. Aloha.
Hi, I'm your host on Think Tech Asia, Bill Sharp. I look forward to you joining us each Monday between 4 and 5 o'clock when we film right here in our studio in downtown Honolulu. The show, Think Tech Asia, focuses on contemporary events in Asia. And by Asia, we mean anything from Hawaii, south to Australia and New Zealand, west to Pakistan, and as far north as the Russian Far East. Clearly, this is one of the most economically dynamic centers of the world, and we bring you up to date on what's going on in a whole host of countries in this very vital region. We look forward to seeing you. Aloha.
Yeah, just a little vignette during the break. You know, the issue is suggested by a Twitter question we got, is that it's very important for history to understand the coming together of cultures, but also the rejection of cultures. And during the 20th century, we had plenty of that. I mean, I'm thinking of anti-Semitism in Europe. You know, people knew each other, and all of a sudden it was a rejection, huge rejection. And this is your country, your family been living here for hundreds, even thousands of years, and all of a sudden you're not a citizen in your own country. This is hard to take. This is so unfair. And there's a strain in human nature that allows for this to happen. And in a funny way, what happened in Germany happened in California.
You know, we never progressed to the final solution, fortunately, but certainly the idea of taking fellow citizens and regarding them as the other and as foreigners and dehumanizing them and criminalizing them and imprisoning them and identifying them. These are really dangerous tendencies in our society.
Dangerous.
They're
yeah.
xenophobic, they're nativist, anti-Japanese in this case, and anti-Semitic in the case of the Holocaust, and we should do everything we can to resist them.
Yeah. You're associated with the Holocaust Museum.
Yes.
What is that association?
Well, my first book was related to a European rescue of Polish Jews by a Japanese diplomat during the Holocaust, and I ended up working for the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, which is based in Washington, D.C., in Tokyo, as their Japan-based researcher and acquiring of loans. I did that kind of work for a long time. And then when I came here, they have been able to give me some work with their website in Japanese, and so I review the articles in Japanese that are going onto the website to educate Japanese about the Holocaust. The Japanese really do not have much familiarity with Judaism and the Holocaust, and they are susceptible to anti-Semitic texts. So, yeah, so I still work for the Holocaust Museum in Hawaii.
Try to keep people educated, keep
Yeah.
their level of awareness up, yeah. What an interesting background for you to write this book then.
It's been wonderful. Yeah.
So, back to the plot, back to the story. Okay, where were we now?
So Harry and Mary are interned in the wake of Pearl Harbor. They're interned in early 1942 from Los Angeles, ultimately sent to a concentration camp in Arizona. And Harry volunteers for the U.S. Army as a linguist in Japanese and English from the internment camp. And he has such poor eyesight that he does not believe that he will be sent abroad. He thinks he'll just end up in some brick building somewhere, maybe in Washington, D.C., translating documents. But he is so tremendously bilingual from his 5 years in Japan, very quick mind, that he is sent to the Pacific, ends up becoming a POW interrogator and translator. And he island hops through the Pacific at the same time, knowing that because of their age, it's likely that his brothers are in the Japanese army, and he's correct.
Ooh, that's very antsy kind of experience. So here you are, you have to have a certain aggressive conduct to interrogate the prisoners, but the prisoners are army mates of your own family.
So he wonders whether he will come into contact and where, at a front in the Pacific or in Japan with his brothers. And he has good reason to wonder that because he has an encounter in New Guinea with someone he knew in Hiroshima. So it's entirely plausible. And in fact, in 1945, the summer of 45, Harry's in Manila preparing to land on Japan because there was an enormous invasion slated for November 1st, 1945. And he's preparing to invade the same island where his brothers
He
are
was at the
located.
front then.
He
This
was-
wasn't an administrative position. He would go where the troops would go.
Yes, he was landing with the troops under
Yeah.
enemy fire.
Yeah. Ooh.
Uh,
And then talking to the enemy.
Yes.
As soon as anyone was captured.
Yes,
And always wondering if he would run into his own family.
yes. It was fraught.
Yeah,
And his brothers didn't know what had happened to him because they had lost contact during the war when Harry and Mary were interned. But they are in the same place where he is supposed to land.
Was this unique, you think, the story that you found here? Or were there other families where the same thing was happening?
That's why I think it's so remarkable, is that there were others to whom this occurred, and it's not really known. And particularly for people in Hawaii, I think that there are those I tell the story to, and they're like, "Oh, that's what happened in my family too. My uncle was in Japan during the war for his education, couldn't get back, and so the family was divided." And so in Hawaii particularly, it resonates, but I'm so glad about that, and I'm glad to disseminate this to a larger audience because I think people have to know that families were divided and they coped the best they could, and they were still able to maintain their loyalties and their love for one another.
What's the Japanese word, gaman?
They had tremendous gaman, perseverance.
Yeah. They could tough it out.
Absolutely.
These ordinary people would have trouble.
They were trained in gaman.
Yeah. Okay, so carry me forward.
Okay, so of course the invasion does not occur because the atomic bombs are detonated above Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August of 45. And on August 6th, when the bomb explodes above Hiroshima, Harry's mother and brother are in the city.
And killed.
Well, I'm not going to give it away.
You're gonna-
I'm going to leave you with a cliffhanger.
It must be in here somewhere.
But there are other family members involved too, and because by the time I wrote the book, the mother had died, but there was a woman, a neighbor, who was with the mother on the day of the bomb, and there were cousins who saw the brother Victor on the day of the bomb, and so I was able to get the story, which was really a treasure. So firsthand accounts of what was happening to
On
the
that
family
day.
at every moment, and that does constitute one chapter.
Like people remember, the day on which Kennedy was killed.
Yes.
They remember the day on which 9/11 took place, but can you imagine remembering the day of the bomb,
Yeah.
especially when you were there in the city?
So, right, and
Yeah,
so
yeah.
nothing will ever be the same for this family
Yeah,
and for tens of thousands of others. And Harry is just shattered when he hears the news because what's coming out of Japan is that the city has been decimated. But he's able to get into the city in October of 45 and reunite.
In the Army.
In the Army, the
He-
U.S.
he
Army.
Manages.
He goes with the 33rd Division, which enters Japan in late September 45 to Kobe, and his general, who is a very kind, mentoring leader, gives him permission to go and find his family, and he tries 3 times, and on the 3rd time he succeeds.
Very touching story.
Yeah.
Very touching. It tells you something that you really didn't know about those days. Those days were more complex than we thought.
Mhm.
We thought we understood World War II, with the Victory at Sea, if you recall those movies on Sunday when I was a kid growing up. Infinite footage of all these ships blowing up the Pacific. but there's much more to World War II. There's much more to the aftermath. There's much more to this connection. So what happened when he finally found his family?
Well, they're in various conditions, and he is so happy to reunite with them. But he does have to go back to the U.S. I mean, Japan is in the throes of the occupation. It's a damaged nation with great famine and disease and poverty. And when the 33rd Division returns to the U.S.,
He had to go with him.
He goes too.
He was in the Army.
He was in the Army.
You can't say no.
Right, and there are no jobs for him particularly.
Yeah.
But he struggles upon his return because all these great years of service to the U.S., and he's once again met with a racist response.
Well, had the racism dissipated after the war? Had people in this country become aware of the 442nd and the 100th Battalion and people like Harry, who were just caught up in something which was way bigger than anything they could control, who had no sea enter at all, who were, innocent victims of the war. Have people learned about that yet? Did they understand in 1945?
The exploits of the 442nd and the 100th had been promoted because those units were formed in large part to show the Japanese-American dedication to the United States. But Harry was part of the Military Intelligence Service, which was this clandestine unit attached to various divisions in the Pacific. And because they were using their linguist skills and the Japanese were littering the front with their plans as they retreated, the U.S. didn't want anybody to know that they had these Japanese Americans who were so linguistically talented reading the intelligence. And so they were not advertised. In fact, their photos were prohibited from being shown anywhere. But Signal Corps wasn't even supposed to take them.
Interesting.
So the MIS went under the radar. And Harry, when he wore his uniform in California, it was okay. He still couldn't get a job. But if he was in civilian clothes, people really gave him a hard time. Yeah. So he ends up actually having a very compelling reason to go back to Japan. And over the years, I'm jumping ahead, he will become one of the first Japanese American colonels in the U.S. Army and a great bridge between the cultures and one of the major forces in the occupation. And there's a lot that happens to his family.
So he stayed in the Army?
He stayed in the Army for his entire...
He was promoted?
He was promoted ultimately, and
they recognized his
they
value.
recognized him and honored him. And when he finally retired, and he was lauded with every award under the sun, including one of the awards given by the Emperor of Japan and the President's Civilian Award for the highest service that a civilian could do, because at that point he was a civilian, and he really had a life of great satisfaction and contribution. There's a tragedy in the story, but there's a lot of redemption as well.
Yeah. Was there contention in the family about this? I mean, were they angry at each other for taking positions such as in the Allegiance play on Broadway?
That's what's really interesting, is that the family who had been through so much, and they did not do that. They worked to immediately reconcile and bridge their differences. It was just unconditional love.
Come on.
Come on, yeah?
Yeah.
Ah.
What a story. Gee, and this is all true. You spent 15 years or more researching it, down to a huge bibliography and index in the book. Really worth reading. I will definitely read this, Pam.
Thank you, Jay.
Thank you for coming down and sharing it with us, even in advance of your book signing.
My pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Aloha.
Aloha.